Okay, so just by way of brief recap, yesterday we thought about how the shape of Mark, the structure of Mark, can be visualized like this, a two-part narrative, right? And that 1:1 through 1:15 is your introduction with significant eschatological language that the time is fulfilled. This is it. Right? So the language of Isaiah is in there. John the Baptist looks like Elijah. Malachi is also quoted. Zechariah is referenced to. And so when Jesus says the time is fulfilled, he's saying this is what we've been expecting. This is what we've been looking for. And what is that? The kingdom of God is at hand, 1:15. Therefore repent and believe the good news. And immediately thereafter, the next section of the gospel begins, and Jesus has this follow me language, right? And most of the narrative in the first half of the gospel takes place by the sea, where Jesus is demonstrating his power, by the sea of power, right? And all of this is climbing up to the climax in 8:31? Sorry? Yes, 8:30. Yeah, 8:30. Yeah, 27 to 30, right? So let's just say 8:30 for now. And then in 8:31, or rather in 8:30, Peter announces that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, right? And he's come to that conclusion because he's seen all the power by the Sea of Galilee. But in 8:31, Jesus says something that he's never said before. The Son of Man must suffer. And so everything from 8:31 is heading towards the cross and resurrection until we get to 16:8. And then there's a little postscript, I would call it 16:20. Today, we're going to look at, oh, by the way, this is called the way of suffering, right? He's always on the way. If over here he's on the sea, here he's on the way, emphasizing his suffering. So two parts of the gospel, the sea of power and the way of suffering. And we are looking at these last couple chapters, 6 through 8 right now. So just situate us where we are, okay? Sound good? Great. Okay, so go ahead and turn to chapter 6. And if you're looking at the outlines, which I hope you are, we're on number 5. And we're going to have to go a little faster than we did yesterday, which is fine. Nonetheless, if there's anything you'd like me to slow down and address more thoroughly, you just say so. Okay? What I'd like to do, though, is jump ahead to 6:30. 6:30 through 52. This is a significant moment, again, right here at this, on this side of the gospel, exemplifying Jesus' power, where we have the feeding of the 5,000. Okay? Let me read this for us. This will be 6:30 through 52. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away by yourself to a lonely place and rest a while, for many were coming and going. They had no leisure even to eat. And when they went away into the boat to a lonely place by themselves, now many saw them going and knew them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns, and got there ahead of them. And as he went ashore, he saw a great throng. He had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, 'This is a lonely place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the country and villages round about and buy themselves something to eat.' But he answered them, 'You give them something to eat.' And they said to him, 'Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?' And he said to them, 'How many loaves have you? Go and see.' And when they found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. And then he commanded them to sit down by companies upon the grass. And so they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples and set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were about 5,000 men. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up to the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out to sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and they were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Have no fear." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. They were utterly astonished, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Thus far, the reading of God's word. What we need to appreciate from this passage is how strongly it echoes the language of the Exodus, right? So if you take a look here, well, let me ask you, what sort of details from the passage, particularly the feeding of the 5,000, resonated with Exodus themes? Did you hear any of them? It is a deserted place, right? Some translations say lonely place, but the word is eremos, which is the same word for the desert or the wilderness, right? And in Exodus 16:1, Israel came to the wilderness. Good. Anything else? Right. Look at the groups which they sit down in 50s and in hundreds. In Exodus 18, 14, and 21, they are. That's how Moses numbers the people coming out of Egypt. Anything else? Yeah, what'd you notice? Exactly, yeah. So it says in Exodus 16:12, "At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be satisfied with bread." Jesus, of course, gives them bread, and in verse 42 it says they all ate and were satisfied. Good. What else? We're going to come to that. Let's stick right now to the feeding of the 5,000. I'm going to come to that next. Yeah. And you can be thinking about it. You can be thinking about it because did you notice in verse 45, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. What does that recall from yesterday? The last time Jesus was teaching crowds, the parable, yeah. The parable then becomes interpreted in the boat. So I think what's going on here is that this feeding of the 5,000 is an enacted parable. Right? It's an enacted parable. And then the episode in the boat becomes the interpretation for the disciples. It even ends with they don't understand, right? So you can see that there's a connection there. But let's keep looking at this. Notice it says that the people come, verse 33, they ran there on foot. That's a strange detail. How else are they going to get there? But it said in Exodus 12:37 that Israel journeyed into the wilderness on foot. Right, so Mark is grabbing these little details to bring up, to cause us to reminisce about the Exodus. Calling them a great crowd is very similar to Exodus 12:37, where they were a mixed crowd that journeyed out of Egypt. In verse 35, we're told that it's growing late. In Exodus 16:6, it was at evening. Moses says, "You shall know the Lord," and so on and so forth. So clearly, this. One more detail, or maybe this is what you mentioned earlier. The very last verse 44, "And those that ate the loaves were about 5,000 men." In Exodus 12:37, about 600,000 men on foot besides women and children. So that practice of concluding the narrative by counting the men in the group is also a callback to the Exodus. Clearly, Mark is trying to demonstrate here how this feeding in the wilderness is a new Exodus event. But there's more. You notice that it's said to be a desert place in verse 31. Also verse 32. So it's verse 35. it's emphasized that it's a deserted place or a wilderness, a desert, right? But look where Jesus tells them to sit down. Verse 39. What do you notice about verse 39? It's green grass. I thought it was a desert place. I thought it was a wilderness. How do you have green grass in the wilderness? He's leading them back to Eden. I think that's absolutely right. In Ezekiel 34, listen to this. This is Ezekiel 34. For this is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I myself will search for my sheep. Isn't that what it said here in chapter 6? They were like sheep without a shepherd, right? Now listen, the sovereign Lord says, I will search for my sheep and seek them out. As the shepherd seeks out his flock when he is among his scattered sheep, I will seek out my flock, and I will rescue them from all the places they have been scattered. On a cloudy, dark day, I will bring them out from among the people and gather them from foreign countries. I will bring them to their own land. I will feed them on the mountains of Israel, by the streams and all the inhabited places of the land. In a good pasture, I will feed them. The mountain heights of Israel will be their pasture. There they will lie down in a lush pasture, and I will feed them on rich grass on the mountains of Israel. And they will say, this land that was desolate has become like the Garden of Eden. So here's what's going on. You have the Exodus event, way long time ago. They come out at night, on foot. They're hungry. The Lord feeds them with meat and bread, and all are satisfied, right? History of Israel goes on. They come into the land, so on and so forth. But by the time you get to Ezekiel's day, Israel's been scattered. Israel is in exile. They're all over the globe, many in Babylon, but also in other places. They're not living in the land. But Ezekiel sees a day when the Lord himself will effect a second Exodus. He will feed them again, only this time on the mountains of Israel, on the green grass. To the end that when this happens, the creation will be renewed, and the desolate places will become like the Garden of Eden. What's going on here in Mark, therefore, is Mark is splicing in that language of Ezekiel, especially with the sheep, feeding them on the mountains and feeding them on the rich grass, to tell us that when Jesus does these things, he's not just recalling the Exodus. He is effecting the second Exodus, the end times renewal of God's people. In fact, the reason they're told to pick up the leftover fragments, the broken pieces, is a symbolic gesture. Israel has been scattered all over the world, and Jesus is here to regather them and feed them on the mountains. Moreover, how many baskets does he pick up? And what does 12 represent? Say it again. The 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel. So Jesus is doing this miracle not only to feed the people, but to demonstrate right here at this moment, right here in this moment of his story, the clearest demonstration of his new Exodus initiative. And in the language of Ezekiel, therefore, inaugurating the last days where Israel comes back from exile. And so what's going on here is Jesus is saying through him and his 12 apostles, Israel is basically restarting. The new end times people of God originate right here. A couple other things worth mentioning before we go to the part about the boat. Notice it says that he, verse 41, takes the loaves, let's do this now. Verse 41, taking the loaves, he blessed, broke, and gave to his disciples. If you race ahead, keep your finger in chapter 6, but if you race ahead to chapter 14, 22, as they were eating, he took bread and blessed and broke and gave it to them. You see those verbs? Those are the exact same verbs. Take, bless, break, and give. Take, bless, break, and give. That's what he did back on the mountain. He took, he blessed, he broke, and he gave. The point here is that, among other things, the Lord's Supper is therefore a ritualistic reenactment of the feeding of the 5,000, which itself is a ritualistic reenactment of the original feeding in the wilderness. So there's this straight theological line between the first Exodus and how the Lord fed the people, the new Exodus and how Jesus is feeding the people on the mountain, and every time you take the Lord's Supper. I should add the cross, because that's what Jesus is symbolizing in the Last Supper. And then every time you take the Lord's Supper, you're being theologically telescoped back to the days of Moses, back to the days of Jesus. Every single time we take the Lord's Supper, you are participating in a new Exodus symbolic ritual to recall what it means to be brought out of bondage and to be regathered as God's people. One other note, again, before we go to the water walking moment. Look at chapter 8. Chapter 8, verse 1 and following. We have a similar situation where this time there are 4,000 people gathered. There are 4,000 people gathered. And in verse 4, the disciples say to Jesus, "How can one feed," literally fill, "these men with bread here in the desert?" And Jesus does the exact same miracle. This time, however, notice in verse 8, they ate and were satisfied, so same language, and they took up the broken pieces left over. How many baskets full do they pick up this time? How many? 7. 7. Here's the crux. If you go back to chapter 7, verse 24, look where they are. Someone tell me from verse 7:24, where are they? Tyre and Sidon. Does anyone know where they are? Tyre and Sidon? They're north of the land of Galilee, right? And one is off by the Mediterranean Sea. I think that's what you said, right? They're Gentile territory, right? So these are Gentile cities. What's the point here? The point is that if the feeding of the 5,000 is an eschatological realization of Ezekiel 34, the Lord himself gathering his sheep from exile, and this is captured in the number 12, collecting 12 baskets full. When he does it again in Gentile territory, and he collects 7 baskets full, what do you think that means? But that the salvation for Israel is now overflowing to the nations. And that in this new eschatological community of those who follow the Son of God in the kingdom of God, it will be comprised of Jews and Gentiles. Because the Gentiles receive the exact same act of salvation, the feeding here in their territory. And that's what the number 7 represents. 7 in the scriptures represent both the fullness of creation, but then also the number of Gentiles, the number for the Gentiles. In Acts 13:19, we learned that it was 7 nations that Joshua drove out. So number 7 represents Gentiles, which makes sense because it also represents the fullness of creation, which would therefore be what? All people. So Jesus performs the same miracle once in Galilee and once in Gentile territory to demonstrate that the Ezekiel 34 end of days, end of exile salvation is for Jews and then also overflows to include Gentiles. Okay, so a couple things here. Take a look back now at 6:45. And this language, immediately, he told the disciples to get into the boat and dismiss the crowd, should recall for us chapter 4, which is just a moment ago, where on the same day he left the crowd and got into another boat after that parable. And I argued yesterday that episode in the boat was designed to reinforce and interpret the parable of the mustard seed, right? So I think the same thing is going on here. What's about to happen in the boat, only to the disciples, is designed to reinforce and clarify what just happened with the feeding of the 5,000. How so? When he saw them making headway painfully, verse 48, and the wind was against them, it was about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the water of the sea. He meant to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought he was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw, but they were terrified. Let's just pause right there. Can I get a couple volunteers to help us out? You know what? Never mind. I have the text right here. Make it a lot faster. In Exodus 33:17, Exodus 33:17 through 34:8, the Lord passes by Moses. Do you remember that episode? He asks to see his glory, but instead he covers him and he passes him by. Right? In Psalm 77:19 and 20 says, your way, the Lord's way, Yahweh's way, was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Isaiah 43:16. Isaiah 43:16. Thus says the Lord, who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters. Job 9:11. Who alone stretches out the heavens and tramples on the waves of the sea. Behold, he passes me by, I see him not. He moves on, I do not perceive him. What's the point here? Who is the only person in the Old Testament who is able to walk on the water? Say it out loud. Yahweh. Yahweh alone makes a path through the sea and walks across the sea. And in Job 9, as well as in Exodus 33, he does this passing by his people. And then, when Jesus finally speaks, he says, take heart, this is verse 50, ego eimi. This phrase, ego eimi, is the same phrase used in the Septuagint when Yahweh describes himself in Exodus 3. I am who I am. You understand? So this episode of Jesus walking on the water is a way to reinforce what Ezekiel 34 had already said. That Yahweh says, I myself will gather the sheep. I myself will feed them. Jesus is acting out the prerogative of the covenant God of Israel in the feeding of the 5,000. And then, to demonstrate that to his apostles, he does this supernatural thing that only God can do, walk on the water. And then when they're confused of who it is, he simply gives them the divine name. I am, fear not. And then, I think this is critical. And then verse 51, he got in the boat. In early Christian iconography, the church is often portrayed. Actually, do I have a picture of this in the handout? I think I left it out. But in a lot of early Christian iconography, the church is described as living in a boat. Have you ever seen these? And outside the boat are all kinds of waves and monsters and evil creatures trying to attack the boat, right? This is where they get that kind of idea, that the boat is symbolic of the church, and the raging sea all around is symbolic of the suffering and trials and difficulties and persecution that the world is going to throw at the boat. But the point here is that Jesus gets in the boat with us. Jesus is in the boat with us. Jesus doesn't set us out into the difficulties of the suffering world without his own very presence. This is Mark's way of saying what? Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. That's a line from Matthew. Mark wraps it in this more subtle way. But notice how it concludes. What a strange conclusion. And they were utterly astonished, for they did not understand about the loaves, for their hearts were hardened. They did not understand about the loaves because their hearts were hardened. If we think again with our Exodus thinking cap on, who else had a hard heart? Who? Pharaoh. Well, Pharaoh. Let's start with Pharaoh. Pharaoh had a hard heart, right? Pharaoh had a hard heart. And so the disciples are in this strange sort of space in between. They're with Jesus. They're following Jesus. They responded to his call back here at the beginning, follow me, right? But they also just don't understand. They don't understand. They still have hard hearts. So jump ahead now. 8:14. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only one loaf with them. And he cautioned them, saying, take heed, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they discussed it with one another, saying, we have no bread. And being aware of it, Jesus said to them, why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not yet understand? Are your hearts still hardened? There's that language again of perceiving, understanding, no, because we have hard hearts, right? Having eyes, do you not see? And ears, do you not hear? And why do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? In other words, when you saw that 12 baskets were picked up, and then you saw that 7 baskets were picked up, that should have been enough to bring you to understanding of what's going on here, right? And then it's from there that we immediately go into the healing of the blind man, where it takes him 2 times to heal him. Do you remember that from yesterday? Someone please tell for the Council View group what we concluded about that. Right here, right at the very end of this section, there's this episode where Jesus takes 2 shots to heal a man. He lays his hands on his eyes and says, do you see anything? I see men, they look like trees walking. So my eyes are open, I have sight, but it's very blurry. And so then he heals them a second time, and then he saw everything clearly. What did we conclude about that passage yesterday? Yes, right. So this man who he sees, but he doesn't see clearly yet, is demonstrative of Peter, but also everybody who would read the gospel only up to this point. If you read only up to the point of seeing Jesus' power and make the conclusion that he is the Christ, but are not willing to see the full gospel, the second side of the gospel of Jesus' suffering as well, then that's why you don't perceive. That's why you don't see. That's why you have hard hearts, right? This is Jesus' way, not of chastising them for having hard hearts, but just pointing it out. You have hard hearts. You don't see. But that's okay, because we're not to the end of the gospel yet. Once we get there, then you'll see. Then you'll understand. Why does he mean to pass them? Again, it's a way of grabbing some Old Testament language. Because, again, it's Yahweh who passes by Moses in Exodus 33. And in Job 9, it says, he, Yahweh, passes me by. Again, in the context of walking, trampling down the waves of the sea. Job 9, verse 8. So this is a way for Mark to say, here's what happened that night. And in describing it, he's grabbing as much language as he can from the Old Testament where Yahweh is doing things. Yahweh is doing things. Yahweh is walking in the water. Yahweh is passing by Moses. Yahweh is passing by Job. Yahweh is saying things like, I am who I am. You follow me? So he's trying to demonstrate that Jesus is more than just a new Moses. Because in the wilderness, you could say Moses gave them the bread. Yeah, fair enough. But ultimately, Yahweh did, right? So who is Jesus? Is Jesus this new Moses figure? Yes, but even more, he's Yahweh incarnate. And I've tried to argue this yesterday as well. When John the Baptist says, prepare the way of the Lord, and Jesus walks on the way, there's an equating there of Yahweh with Jesus, right? This is why Gemetches yesterday I said, anyone who thinks that Mark has a low Christology just isn't reading carefully enough and isn't understanding the way he's appropriating the Old Testament the language, the prerogatives of Yahweh, and then applying them to Jesus. All right, let's march on then. Let's turn now to, what does the next handout say? Does it say chapter 9? Okay. Several things we want to talk about in chapters 9 and 10. Then we'll take our coffee break, or we'll take our coffee break whenever it comes. But again, if I can still use this diagram here, if this still makes sense to everybody. Mark has this introduction with all kinds of eschatological language. Then he has an emphasis on Jesus' power, one of them being feeding 5,000, feeding 4,000, walking on the water, calming the winds and the waves, all kinds of power by the sea, right? And then right in the middle here is Peter's confession, 8:29 and 30. You are the Christ. And he charged them not to tell anybody. So 8:30 is the high water mark of this first side of the gospel. The conclusion to be drawn from seeing all this power is that you are the Christ. But immediately Jesus says in verse 31, the Son of Man must suffer many things. That is brand new. That he would suffer is brand new. After seeing all this power, you'd wonder how in the world could he possibly suffer. With chapter 9, we click into that side of the story. We click onto that side of the story. And the first episode that happens on this side of the story is the Transfiguration. So let's take a look at that. Can someone read for us? Let's go with, let's back up in 8:38 through 9:8. 8:38. No, that makes it too complicated. Let's just do 9. 9:1 through 8. Can someone read that for us real loud? Chapter 9, verses 1 through 8. Good. Okay. So several things we can say about the Transfiguration here. I'll be brief as I can. In verse 1, let's back up. End of chapter 8, his first announcement of his suffering, right? But he concludes that his suffering will also be followed by coming in glory. This is 8:38. Coming in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Jesus is saying, look, the suffering that's ahead of me is not the end of the story. After that will be glory, right? But first, we have to go through the suffering before we get to the glory. So what the Transfiguration here is, in part, is a temporary glimpse of that future glory. He's showing the disciples, look, we're about to go into the darkest part of my calling, into Jerusalem, where I'll suffer and be killed and so forth. But you need this vision of my glory before we go into that, so that you know that the suffering does not have the last word, right? So it's a bit of a resurrection scene. And it's, of course, it's a new Exodus scene. When he leads them up onto a high mountain, it says, in Exodus 34, Moses went up, of course, onto Sinai, and he was transfigured. His face glowed when he came back down, right? So this is a new Sinai kind of event, so as we expect, with all this other new Exodus language all around. And his garments also became intensely white, like no fuller on earth could bleach them. Do you remember back in chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, we observed how Mark begins the gospel with a quote of Exodus and Isaiah and what? What was the third citation? What is it? Malachi, right. So in Malachi chapter 3, verse 2, I'll go back to verse 1. 3:1. Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. He sits to refine and to purify. In other words, in Malachi, the problem in Malachi's day was that the temple priesthood was corrupt and proper worship was not happening. And so Malachi said the reason the second Exodus hasn't happened yet is because of that corrupt worship. And so this image here of Jesus on the way, now heading straight to Jerusalem, and we'll see when he gets to Jerusalem, he goes straight to the temple, is Mark's way of recalling for us that Malachi theology so that we understand that Jesus himself, again, Jesus is the Lord walking on the way who comes to his temple to purify worship for himself. Remember as well, yesterday we talked about how the point of the Exodus was not only to get people out of Egypt, to get people out of slavery, but to bring them to a sacred space. Bring them to Sinai, bring them to the tabernacle. Right? So in the same way, this new Exodus story will lead directly to the temple in Jerusalem. And as I'll argue after our coffee, when he gets to Jerusalem, he doesn't purify the temple. He predicts its destruction so that he can build a new temple, the temple of his people. Elijah and Moses are there. Why Elijah and Moses? Well, there are several hypotheses for this. One of them is both Elijah and Moses are known as figures who went up onto mountains and had experiences with God. Of course, Moses on Mount Sinai, Elijah at Mount Horeb. I think it's more likely that still what we have here is more Malachi theology. So the very end of Malachi says, "Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I will send Elijah, the prophet, before the great and awesome day of the Lord." Right? So Moses and Elijah are coupled together in Malachi, and now Moses and Elijah are coupled here together again. The presence of the cloud throughout the scriptures, the cloud represents the very presence of God. So I think what we have here is a micro-temple theology on the top of the mountain. This is like a vision into heaven, where Jesus is standing on one side and Moses and Elijah are on the other, the cloud representing heaven and earth being conjoined at the same spot. The point being that when Jesus is resurrected into his glory, he will construct the new temple that will fill the whole globe. I think Mark is sort of sowing the seeds for that he will then prove throughout the rest of the gospel. My principal point for arguing this is in the very next episode. Notice what happens when they come down from the mountain. Jump down to verse 14. "And when they came to the disciples, they being Jesus, Peter, James, and John, they saw a great crowd about them and the scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, 'What are you discussing with them?' And one of the crowd answered him, 'Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a dumb spirit, and wherever it seizes him, it dashes him to the ground, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And I asked his disciples to cast it out, and they were not able.' And he answered them, 'O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me.' And they brought the boy to him. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, 'How long has he been like this?' And he said, 'From childhood. And it has often cast him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. And if you, Jesus, can do anything, have pity on us and help us.' And Jesus said, 'If you can, all things are possible to him who believes.' Immediately the father of the child, I must have skipped a line. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, 'I believe, help my unbelief.' And when Jesus saw the crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit and said to it, 'You dumb and deaf spirit, I command you, come out from him and never enter him again.' And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, 'He is dead.' But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, 'Why could we not cast it out?' And he said to him, 'This kind is driven out only by prayer.'" This story immediately follows the transfiguration so that we connect the transfiguration to the resurrection. When the demon is cast out of the boy, notice that it says, they thought he was dead, and he fell down like a corpse. But Jesus lifts him up and raises him. Those are the exact same words that will be used for Jesus when he's dead and then when he's resurrected. You understand? This is a resurrection foreshadowing here at the bottom of the Mount of Transfiguration. And so what Mark is doing for us is he's connecting the transfiguration, the vision of Jesus' glory, with his own coming resurrection. That is to say, at the resurrection, Jesus will permanently re-enter into the transfiguration kind of glory. And all of this is at the very beginning of this way of suffering, to get the story going in this direction. That when we see the suffering Jesus himself is about to encounter in Jerusalem, we will know that on the other side there will be resurrection and there will be glory. And what that translates to his people is, if we think back, Jesus called us also to take up our cross and follow him and to suffer. Therefore, the conclusion is made that Jesus is promising to us that if we suffer for his name, if we die for his name, we too will be raised up in glory. All of this is baked into the narrative here at the very beginning of Jesus' road of suffering. Oh, one other thing. One other point. So it's foretelling his resurrection, but also insofar that it was a temple scene, it's connecting, therefore, the idea of the new temple with Jesus' resurrection. That when Jesus is raised, that will be when the new temple is built. And so what we'll just see is, in verse 22 here, it says that the Spirit tried to destroy the boy. That term destroy is the exact same term used for the temple. When the temple is destroyed in Mark 13, it's also the same term that the Pharisees use when they want to kill Jesus. They seek to destroy him. The point being that by destroying Jesus, they are destroying the true temple, so that when Jesus is raised, the true temple is also being raised. Believe me, more on that in chapter 11 and following. But it's all sort of being put in seed form here at the beginning. Storytellers like to do that. They like to hint at things. They like to give you little clues and then capitalize on it later. Okay, someone had a question? Was it Shock or was it you, Abel? Because the scribes were not talking about Moses. I think the scribes, again, were talking about Malachi and the expectation that Elijah will come. In Malachi, we're simply told to remember Moses, but be on the lookout for Elijah. So remember Moses, but Elijah is the one coming. Do you follow me? So it's just not in the Jewish tradition that a new Moses will come, but a new Elijah will. I'm glad you mentioned that. Let me also comment briefly on verse 7. The voice that comes from the cloud, "This is my son, listen to him," is a reference to Deuteronomy 18. In Deuteronomy 18, Moses promises that a new prophet like Moses will come. And so the reason for Moses and Elijah's appearance together could be that Elijah was a prophet like Moses. He did similar miracles to Moses. And so Jesus, however, is the still greater prophet than even Elijah. So it's a commentary, therefore, on the prophetic tradition that Moses is the first prophet, and he promises some end-time final prophet par excellence, and Elijah is like a stepping stone on the way to that. But Jesus is the ultimate one, because the voice from the cloud, God himself says, "This is my son, listen to him." That's what Deuteronomy 18 says. When he comes, you must listen to him. But why the scribes don't emphasize Moses in that way, I don't know. It's probably because they're referring to Malachi, and Malachi only mentions Elijah coming. Good question. Yeah, Gemetchus. Yeah, I think he's referring to the transfiguration. So when he says there are some who will not taste death before they see the kingdom come in its power, immediately he takes Peter, James, and John. Those are the some. Those are the some who then get a glimpse of the coming power of the kingdom. Yeah, sorry, I was too fast on that. So the cloud in the Old Testament, let's just think of two episodes. At the end of the book of Exodus, The glory cloud of the Lord fills the tabernacle, right? And in 1 Kings 8, after Solomon builds the temple, again, the glory cloud fills the temple there, right? So cloud represents God's presence on earth. And climactically, with the temple and the tabernacle, God wants to dwell in the sacred space of the tabernacle, the most holy of holies. And so that's what he does. And so the presence of the cloud here tells us that we have a temple vision. We have a temple vision. So there's no edifice here. It's just Jesus standing there, and he sees Moses and Elijah. That may be why Peter says, let us make some booths, some tabernacles, because we need a physical construct. So he's thinking along that line. So that's the meaning of the cloud there, to let us know that this is a temple vision. And to be clear, inside the Holy of Holies, in both the tabernacle and the temple, is where, if this is earth, is where heaven and earth touch. So that inside the most holy place is where heaven above, where God lives, earth beneath, where we live, touch in that one spot, just in the Holy of Holies, right? So this transfiguration is the same thing. It's a vision into the place where heaven has now come to touch the earth. Does that make sense? And that's the purpose for the clouds. Now, that was only the first part of your question. What was the second part of the question? Oh, right. Okay. So, yeah, I got ahead of myself. So, insofar that this is attached also to Jesus' resurrection by the same language that's going to be used. In other words, when this is happening up on the mountain, this boy is dying at the base, and Jesus raises him. He's not quite dead. It's symbolic, but the language that's used to describe him is the same language used to describe Jesus later. And his rising up is used to describe Jesus rising up. So therefore, this boy is foreshadowing Jesus' resurrection. So you have temple happening here and resurrection happening here. So that when you get to the end and you see Jesus' resurrection, you will also equate that with a permanent new temple reality. The idea of filling the whole earth, however, will come in the next couple chapters. No. Well, you could also simply say the Old Testament expectation is that in the latter days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be the greatest of all mountains and fill the earth. And so there are predictions in the Old Testament, but that's going to be developed later in Mark. I think, and I'll talk about this tomorrow with Matthew, when it comes to the Olivet Discourse, I think Jesus is talking about his own death and resurrection, the destruction of the temple, and the end of time, space, all in the same breath without telling us when is he talking about one or the other. Because they're theologically aligned, he can talk about them all at the same time, right? And so in the same way, Jesus coming in the glory of his Father surely suggests his return, but that we only think that from the vantage point of where we are in history. When we get to Mark 13, it seems like the coming of the Son of Man is not coming from heaven to earth, but from earth to heaven, to take his reign, to rule over the whole earth, as it even says in chapter 1 of this book, 1:1, the kingdom of God through his Son over the whole globe. And so therefore, if it's true that the resurrection is the moment of glorification for Jesus, then that would mean the coming of the glory of his Father in 838 is also the resurrection, or his 2,000-year session going on 2,000 years.
One is describing something different than 838.
No, it's probably the same, and the transfiguration is therefore a glimpse of that. So when he says some here will not taste death until they see it, it being the full glory of his Father, Jesus coming into the glory of his Father, and Peter, James, and John get a temporary glimpse right now. Now, throughout gospel scholarship has fallen all over themselves with this language of the coming of the Son of Man, especially when it says things like, this generation will not pass away, or Matthew 10, you will not have gone through all the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes, or this one here, when he comes in his glory, and some of you will not taste death. If that means the return of Jesus, then gospel scholars are saying Jesus was wrong. The early Christians thought Jesus would return in their lifetime, and he didn't. right? And so everybody's got some kind of interpretation to sort of get Jesus off the hook or get the Christians off the hook, how he didn't exactly mean this generation or something like that. However, if it means not Jesus coming from heaven to earth, but for coming from earth to heaven to take his session at the right hand of God and rule the nations from heaven, then that happened. That happened at the ascension. And then attached to that is, of course, the giving of the Spirit to his people, who then, Julian, go out and fill the whole earth in Acts chapter 1. And I think that's actually a better interpretation, which I'll say more about, I think, tomorrow. Does that make sense?